Have you ever caught yourself speaking one way with your friends, but then a completely different way in, say, a job interview? Or maybe even a third way with your family? We all do it. But why? What are those little shifts in how we pronounce things or the words we choose actually telling people? Well, that's what this explainer is all about. We're going to dive into the science of how we speak, what our language reveals about us, and how we use it to build our own unique identity. Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the big question. Why don't we all sound the same? Then we'll get into the key tool that linguists use to measure these differences. After that, we'll look at how dialects are tied to where we're from and our social groups. We'll zoom in on a classic study from New York City that really blew the doors open on this. And finally, we'll bring it all together to see how this creates the style of you. All right, let's jump right in. More than just words. We're going to kick things off with a super simple observation. One that unlocks this whole world of social meaning that's hiding in plain sight. Or maybe I should say in plain sound. So, just think about it for a second. Which one do you say more often? Do you hit that hard G at the end of words like singing, running, or doing? Or do you kind of soften it and say singin', runnin', doing? Go on, say it out loud. That's not just some random quirk. That little choice, which you probably don't even think about, is a perfect example of what linguists call language variation. It's like one of a million tiny forks in the road we take every single time we open our mouths, and each path carries a little piece of social information about who we are, where we're from, and the situation we find ourselves in. And this quote right here, it reframes this whole idea perfectly. It tells us to stop thinking about our speech as being right or wrong, and instead to think of it as style. Just like a style of clothing or music or architecture. The way you speak has roots. It belongs to a place, to a community, and, this is the most important part, it has social meaning. It's not a mistake, it's a design. Okay, so if speech is a style, how do we actually measure it? How do you study this stuff scientifically? Well, to do that, sociolinguists needed a new kind of tool, a new unit of measurement. And that brings us to the absolute bedrock of the field, the linguistic variable. This is the key concept right here. The linguistic variable is the abstract thing that changes, like, say, the ending on ing words. The variants are the different ways it actually gets said in the real world, the sounds we actually make. So think of it this way. The variable is the question, and the variants are all the possible answers. And this table just makes it super concrete. The variable, which we write in parentheses, is the feature we're studying. So for that ng variable, one variant is that sound you make at the back of your throat for singing, and the other is the one you make at the front of your mouth for sing in. Or take the R variable in a word like car. The variants are pretty simple. You either pronounce the R or you don't. This framework is what lets linguists turn speech into data they can actually count and analyze. Now, this is so important. This choice isn't random. For a long time, people thought these little switches were meaningless. They even called it free variation. But the whole revolution of sociolinguistics was showing that it's not free at all. The choice you make is influenced or constrained by who you are, who you're talking to, your social class, your age, where you are. It's not 100% predictable, but it's definitely not random. It follows patterns. So once researchers were armed with this really powerful tool, the linguistic variable, they could start looking at dialects in a completely new light. And this led to a huge shift, moving away from just mapping where people lived and toward understanding who they were inside that community. So you had the old school approach, regional dialectology. This was all about mapping language across space. They looked for what they called conservative speakers, usually older, rural guys who hadn't moved around much, because they thought those guys preserved the purest old forms of the language. But then social dialectology came along and flipped the whole thing on its head. It moved into the cities, focusing on things like social class and age, and it studied how language is actually being used to drive change within one single messy, diverse place. Now, the classic tool for the old-school regional folks was something called an isogloss. And honestly, the best way to think about it is like a weather front, but for language. On one side of the line, people use one variant, and on the other side, they use a different one. Simple as that. And sometimes you'd get a whole bunch of these lines for different features all running close together. That's called a bundle of isoglosses, and that can mark a really major dialect boundary. A super famous example is the Rhinish fan over in Germany, which shows this big sound change spreading and separating Low German from High German. But the truth is, These neat little bundles are actually pretty rare. Most of the time, the lines just crisscross all over the place, which just goes to show you how complex and fuzzy these dialect areas really are. So if dialects aren't about these clean lines on a map, and they're more about these complex social groups, how in the world do you study that in a huge, chaotic place like a city? Well, that brings us to one of the most famous case studies in the entire history of sociolinguistics, carried out by the legendary William Labov in New York City. So, back in the 60s, Labov wanted to know if there was a real, measurable connection between a person's social class and whether or not they pronounced their R's, saying car versus caw. But to get the data, he couldn't just walk up with a clipboard. He needed people's natural speech. So he came up with this absolutely ingenious method called the Rapid and Anonymous Survey. Basically, he went shopping. His method was it was pure genius. First, he picked 3 department stores that pretty clearly represented different social classes. You had the really high-end Saks, the mid-range Macy's, and the more budget-friendly S. Klein. Second, he'd go up to a salesperson and ask a question where he knew the answer was 4th floor. Third, and this is the clever part, he'd lean in and go, "Excuse me?" That made them repeat the answer, 4th floor, but this time more slowly, more carefully. And as he walked away, he'd scribble down notes on whether they pronounced their R's. And that was the magic phrase, 4th floor. It gave Labov 2 chances to hear the R variable, the R in 4th and the R in floor. And he got 2 different styles of speech, their quick, casual response, and then their more careful, repeated one. All of this in just a few seconds, completely anonymously. Brilliant. Now, this chart here, this isn't the specific department store data, but it's from his wider New York study, and it shows the incredible pattern he found. This is the big aha moment. Look at this. In casual, everyday speech, people use that prestigious R sound way less. But when they were in a more formal interview, its use started to climb. And when he asked them to do something really formal, like read a word list out loud where they're paying a ton of attention to their speech, the use of R just shot through the roof. And that right there is the huge takeaway. Labov proved, with data, that our speech isn't fixed. We shift our style depending on the social situation and, as he argued, how much attention we're paying to how we talk. This phenomenon is called style shifting, and it is something that every single one of us does, all the time, whether we realize it or not. Okay, so let's tie this all together. We've got linguistic variables, we've got social factors like class, and now we have this idea of style shifting. So how do all these pieces come together to create the unique language of you? Well, Labov also gave us this useful little toolkit for sorting these variables based on how aware we are of them. So at the very bottom, you've got indicators. These are features that might vary, but nobody really notices. They don't carry much social meaning. Then, in the middle, you have markers, like that New York City R. These definitely carry social information, and they're the things we style shift with. We're sort of subconsciously aware of what they mean. And then at the very top, you have stereotypes. These are the famous, often imitated features that everybody knows about, like the classic Boyd for bird in New York. So here's the bottom line. All this variation, it isn't just noise in the system. It is the system. It's this incredibly rich toolkit that we all use, consciously or not, to signal who we are, where we fit in, and how we see the world around us. We are literally building our social identity, brick by brick, with these variables every single time we speak. And this quote from the linguist Michael Holliday makes this final, crucial point. Style isn't just some extra flair we add on for special occasions. It's not the icing on the cake. It's baked into the cake. Style is a fundamental, absolutely inseparable part of how we make meaning with language in every single thing we say. So I'll leave you with this final thought. Every single one of us is a dialect speaker. We all have our own personal style, our own idiolect that's built from all the variants that are floating around in our communities. So the next time you hear yourself or someone else shifting their speech just a little bit, ask yourself, what story is their language telling in that exact moment?